I'm going to present my make my presentation for the Social Ontology Conference. So I'm just sharing my presentation. So I'm a doctoral scholar at IIT Delhi in philosophy. My thesis is on the use of notions of mathematics and physics in uh, in formalisms in literature. Consequently, I'm interested in the role of physics in something like social physics, which is the topic of my paper, social ontology, which is involved in the topic of my paper, social ontology, in the light of the primacy of social change. Now, one of the problems that social theories must confront is that they're often required to presume a social ontology that does not preclude the possibility of desirable social change. This requirement often binds theorists in a rather peculiar manner. How to derive an internally consistent social ontology while laying ground for a theory of social change? The question gets particularly complicated because we may even have theories dedicated narrowly to social change themselves, but which do not have an obligation to accommodate changes which are desirable in a particular manner. Now, I would like to underline the nature of this dilemma by comparing its manifestation in a set of interconnected thinkers, Gabriel Tarde and Levi-Strauss. I mean, these are two well-known sociologists and anthropologists. I will begin this conversation by observing the influence of Gabriel Tarde on the Indian reformer and thinker R.Ambedkar. Ambedkar chooses Tarde to think of caste and its annihilation because Tarde retains the primacy of individual behavior in group action, which introduces an essential contingency to the structure of the group as a whole, thus keeping the door open for progress towards a more egalitarian society. So, such a progress becomes a possibility because of an inherent contingency that is there in Tarde's theory. Now, while Tarde's advocacy of the diversity of individual behavior is not to be mistaken as a precursor of methodological individualism, it is clear that there is a denial of the relative givenness of social systems, of the collective, of the force of the collective over and above the agency of the individuals. In spite of the bracketing of the abstraction that is the social, in the favor of the concrete immediacy of social groups, of small groups, small social groups, Tart must eventually confront another level of abstraction, perhaps higher than society itself. That is the question of the social change. It is evident that the problem of social transformation is of great interest to Tart, but the question is at what level? Tart is interested in micro-social transformations that continuously happen at the level of small groups and insists that these kind of changes needed to be properly recorded and examined should they be dismissed as indiscernible by some. To be sure, the theme of change is inherently animating the dynamism associated with the laws of imitation that Tard has come to be defined by. In other words, Tard desists from any substantive theory of social change while being interested in it as a phenomenon. It is here that an interesting controversy arises around the interpretation of Gabriel Tard. Now, it is logical to deduce an absence of historical telos from this radical anti-social, anti-collectivist view of the contingencies observed at the level of the individual. Now, this is the view that is sort of propagated by people like Bruno Latour. However, the likes of Anthony King dispute such an inherent and almost nihilistic randomness in Tard's purported views of social change. King objects to Latour's views in two ways. He disputes Latour's reading of the individual as being defined by unconscious imitation alone. Uh, King believes that Tarde takes the view that the individual is much more conscious of his actions. So, uh, so what Tarde actually says is that uh, not only is the collective not a given, even the individual itself is not a finished entity. The individual is driven by unconscious desires, unconscious imitations of other people's behavior, things like that. Now, this brings, so King believes that Tarde takes the view, actually, that the individual is much more conscious of his actions. Now, this brings in a certain normative perspective that bears on the naturalness of unjust social orders like slavery. Now, what I mean by that is that because the individual is somewhat conscious of his actions, it is difficult to justify unjust structures as being the result of unconsciously driven behavior or unconsciously driven modes of imitation alone. Now, Tarde believes that such unjust orders are put in place by force and not through the freedom that is the condition of possibility of imitation and the repetition of these imitations of these individual behaviors. In other words, Tarde is anxious about the possibility of deriving an ought from an is. Now, we are also seeing a version of a more familiar debate here. The uh, the cut the we are which is the distinction between the normative and the descriptive. But this is not exactly that debate in social ontology, in the social ontology scholarship, where when the normative descriptive debate comes, we are presuming a kind of methodological individualism, and we are sort of going from a bottom-up basis. We are not actually having that, although a shade, and this distinction is very important because I want to see this as a fresh debate. So, but we will keep aside this specific distinction between the normative and the descriptive at the level of the individual and focus on the idea of a social change as a whole. That is, here we are talking about a teleology that imposes itself on the collective, on the social. If we are to talk about, social change, desirable social changes, if you are to talk about, you know, uh, having a view about why certain social orders are unjust or just. So, returning to Ambedkar, Ambedkar draws from the contingency of individual behavior as elucidated by the laws of imitation to show how caste emerges through the practice of individual behaviors like untouchability, for example. So, untouchability is not just practiced by lower the upper so-called upper caste with the lower caste. Even among the lower caste, there is practice of untouchability where in that hierarchy they practice untouchability with even lower castes which are even lower, the lowest of the low. So in that sense there is an imitation of the behavior of untouchability, if you like. So but it is this sort of contingency through which the behavior of imitation sort of propagates that allows for the possibility that ultimately caste behavior may change and, so to speak, caste itself may be annihilated. Now, if we follow King, and in a way, I would say Tarde may deem caste to be such an unjust phenomenon that it is not correct to explain it through the social physics of your and sort of to justify it through social physics. You can begin to explain the laws of imitation, but you cannot deem there is such an inherent contingency that you cannot justify it either. So now here, what he would say is that, or I would say is that Ambedkar is also conscious of the possibility of deriving an ought from an is. That is why there is a rejection of the primacy of the collective. And in that sense, I would say Ambedkar wouldn't have to worry so much about, because what Tarde already says is that while caste is obviously driven by his laws of imitation, there is something unnatural about caste too. And that is the reason caste will eventually dissolve into more just societies, and it will give way to more just societies, which are also more natural. So now all these case studies ask a fundamental question: can we have a social ontology without a social physics? I believe that this is a potentially more engaging discussion than the conflict between the normative and the descriptive. Assuming one factors in social physics, then to accost the creature that is desirable social change. What is the nature of the idealization that allows one to conceive a social ontology without social physics? I mean, one might even believe that we can have a social ontology from scratch and not worry about what social physics it will lead to. And so, what is the idealization that allows for that? The reverse is also true. One may construct a social physics without any adequate clarity about social ontology. And we can ask what are the relative epistemological costs of either exercise. So, we can argue that, and I think this is a bit of what we see, this the latter, where we have a social physics without a social ontology, a real proper social ontology, is what we see in the case of Levi-Strauss. We can argue that there is an elaboration of social physics in the thought of Levi-Strauss that shows such extreme levels of immersion observed in the metaphors of hotness and coldness of societies that would it would look like this version of social thermodynamics can function independent of any social ontology. I mean, what Levi-Strauss says is that societies aspire to constrain and resist social change, while hot societies, cold societies aspire to constrain and resist social change, while so-called hot societies make it a principle of their existence and it sort of drives their development. But cold societies try to annihilate this change by building mechanisms like institutions. Levi-Strauss compares these societies to clock-like mechanisms that measure time in order to maintain cyclic rhythms. They basically what happens is there is so basically these cyclic rhythms provide a sort of the possibility of a steady regular movement that combats disorder. So he often compares hot societies to steam engines, for example. So whatever it is, all these energetic models of transformation, they the level at which Levi-Strauss talked about them, he is not concerned about clarifying what is the underlying social ontology, what is its if you because the tendency is to take social ontology as a premise for social physics, right? But that's not the case. So what we may observe that social now in this case, the interesting thing, of course, is when we come back to the question of desirability of social change and the teleology of it, the interesting thing is that what we may observe is that Levi-Strauss is what we observe about Levi-Strauss is the nascent association of values with certain attributes of the social physics. When one reads Gabriel Tarde, there is a subtle nod to the value of dynamism in a society, especially in the role of imitation, in the emergence of inventions and art and new inventions and newer art forms. Similarly, we notice an inherent value being associated with the physical notion of stability in the thought of Levi-Strauss. Uh, I mean, if we can go back earlier and say in Hobbes, we see a privileging of social order, the physical idea of order as a virtue. We may ask if the notion of value is fundamentally concomitant, it sort of sneaks in with any kind of social physics. And I mean, this is the philosopher Giles Chatelet goes one step further and critiques these veiled value associations and points out why social physics may be distorted enough to become pseudo-scientific alibi that naturalizes market democracies, for example, as in the case of Hobbes and Adam Smith, that's his thing, the idea of invisible order and the idea of order in or other words, social physics is somehow implicated in the judgment of what kind of social change is desirable. It is hard to imagine a so-called neutral, value-neutral social physics. Now let us return to the specific case of caste. Here, uh, in terms of social ontology, Levi-Strauss insists on explaining the necessity of a structure foreclosing the possibility of change. So, in some sense, if Levi-Strauss would be applied to thinking about caste, you would think about caste as a hard structure where which has its own self-justifying necessity. His valorization of the idea of a static structure where all its elements are part of a harmonious whole is very significant. This is not to say that Levi-Strauss does not accommodate the idea of change at all. Instead, he conceives social change to be mirroring the second law of thermodynamics, the arrow of time moving towards more and more disorder, more and more entropy. Do we preserve a consistency between Levi-Strauss' idea of the static social structure and the destiny of its one-way disintegration? While there is an element of nostalgia for older structures which are static, one may safely assume an overall disinterestedness in the values associated with one kind of change, one kind of social change vis-a-vis another. Or otherwise, we can also go another way. One may look at the nostalgia for older social structures as a rejection of the social change brought upon by what is broadly termed as modernity. So, in some case, Levi-Strauss could be seen as valorizing the idea of caste, if that's what he means by nostalgia for old social structures. Now, one may ask if getting rid of the burden of the possibility of social change truly liberates the description of social ontology or an eye for uh, or on the other hand, an eye for a theory of change makes one more accountable to the task of explaining previous historical changes using the social ontology one commits to. Moreover, isn't it true that the social physics implicitly assumes a social ontology anyway? In the case of Levi-Strauss, we see a certain, uh, I would say, a certain consciousness of this question because there is some focus on social ontology separately in some other parts of his work, where there are discussions of the influence of the structure on the mental categories of individuals. Individual psychology is constrained and determined by social structures, but this may strike one as a lazy postulate, postulation that seeks to build a hasty bridge between social ontology and social physics. Levi-Strauss makes a more substantive argument regarding the connection between social ontology and social physics when he brings in the question of scale. So, uh, Levi-Strauss makes a distinction between mechanical and statistical models. By social ontologies, we typically mean the mechanics of the relationship between individuals. This is the inevitable molecularity of social ontology. On the other hand, the thermodynamic metaphors characteristic of social physics in Levi-Strauss get activated at a higher scale. Social ontology and social physics can be then used to name levels of analysis. And this is what Levi-Strauss, I'm quoting him, actually says on this. It should also be kept in mind, in quotes, it should also be kept in mind that what makes social structure studies valuable is that structures are models, the formal properties of which can be compared independently of their elements. The structuralist task is thus to recognize and isolate levels of reality which have strategic value from his point of view, namely which admit of representations as models, whatever their type. If it often happens that the same data may be considered from different perspectives, embodying equally strategic values, though the resulting models will be in some cases mechanical and in others statistical. This situation is well known in the exact and natural sciences. For instance, the theory of a small number of uh, for instance, in the theory of a small number of physical bodies belongs to a classical mechanics. But if the number of bodies becomes greater, then one could rely on the laws of thermodynamics. That is, use a statistical model instead of a mechanical one, though the nature of the data remains the same. Now, this is my conclusion. In many ways, Levi-Strauss provides what can be called a rather convenient way out of the contentions between social change and social uh, ontology. Perhaps social change may be considered to be taking place at a scale that acquires its own autonomy, irrespective of the social ontology we choose. At the same time, this allows one the freedom to undertake, I mean, to be fair to Levi Strauss, to undertake the necessarily somewhat speculative exercise that is social physics, especially the social physics of social change over history, where we don't have access to that kind of a fine-grained data. So there is an element of wild speculation, which I believe should not be constrained by a very clear premise of what your social ontology is. But well, I mean, I believe there is an element of convenience also. And this is why I find Gabriel Tarde very interesting, because the solution is very different. Like, where Tarde is having molecularity, contingency of social in the very social ontology. And that means the social ontology is not a different scale for Tarde. Social ontology itself is like a micro social physics. And this makes Tarde kind of commitment about normativity of individual behavior and the naturalness of various social orders more interesting, because for Tarde has taken it upon himself to really bridge the theoretical gap between social physics and the premise social ontology. And his suggestion is that social ontology is micro social physics. And I believe that this is a very different solution from the one that we see in Levi-Strauss, which is more speculative in nature. And I think this is what I want to talk about when I want to really open up this debate about how do we think about social ontology in the light of social change. Thank you. I thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for your time.